The Beatles have left perhaps the most revered artistic impact upon the modern world. Although the art form of music composition has a long history and almost universal presence among the human race worldwide, no singular entity has ever used music as a vehicle for societal change and artistic transformation the way the Beatles did in the 1960s. Liszt had teenage girls screaming for him, and many believed Bach's melodies were proof of God's existence, but Beatlemania took songwriting to a level of cultural influence that is only rivaled by the likes of Homer and Shakespeare. Music in the modern day only makes sense with the context that it is set after the Beatles' legendary catalog, which has set the standard for popular music. In Nietzsche's very first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, which he wrote when he was only 27 years old, he presents the theory that superior forms of art balance two key fundamental forces within the nature of reality. He found the perfect example of the superior art in classical Greek tragedy, with Sophocles representing its highest point, and subsequently explained its corruption as exemplified by the inferior works of the later Euripides. He called these two forces the Apollonian and the Dionysian, after the two Greek gods respectively. The Apollonian, after the god Apollo, represents form, order, structure, light, and poetry. The essence of Apollonian art is that of individuation, or the process of becoming in form. Apollo is the god of measure and appearance, and is also heavily associated with prophecy and the realm of dreams, hence the famous oracle of Apollo at Delphi. The example Nietzsche gives for a truly Apollonian art is that of the Greek epics, such as Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. These works of art present reality as an ordered narrative of images, with vivid depictions of heroes, battle, and gods. It is a work of individual characters and logical sequential events. Even the structure of the poetry itself follows a form, as seen in its meter and rhyme. The Apollonian art is that of the dream, because dreams produce clear, beautiful images out of chaos, with its distinct characters, scenes, and structure. The Dionysian, in contrast, is the opposite of individuation. It represents the melting of borders, structure, and identity. Dionysian art causes the individual sense of self to dissolve into a collective united experience. Dionysian art causes ecstasy, rapture, and extreme emotional intensity. Thus, if Apollonian art is like a state of dreaming, then Dionysian art is like a state of intoxication. Festivals with wine, dancing, and music are the best example of the Dionysian in its pure form. Nietzsche believes specifically that music is the most Dionysian art, relating no tangible order or form like poetry or architecture, but instead pure, raw emotion and energy. The Dionysian embraces harsh truths like suffering and chaos, and transforms it into an affirmation of life. Greek tragedy at its peak, such as in the Oedipus cycle, represents to Nietzsche a truly exceptional balance of these two fundamental psychological forces. It achieves this by incorporating both a structured narrative with dialogue and individual characters, while simultaneously interjecting musical choruses into key moments. Later Greek tragedies suffered due to the influence of Socrates, in which the tragedy turned into a sort of philosophic commentary, and thus fell away from its previous high form. The very essence of the Beatles as an artistic identity can be summed up as a balance between two forces. John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the primary songwriters of the Beatles, formed their legendary Lennon-McCartney equal credit agreement when they were teenagers. The dimorphism of the Beatles is one that goes all the way down into the very art form which they both inherited and helped create. Paul McCartney's father, Jim McCartney, was himself a musician, teaching Paul the jazzy Tin Pan Alley style that was popular prior to World War II. The style, containing both lyrics and music, was assembled as opposed to arising naturally. What I mean by this is that Tin Pan Alley songs were usually composed by a composer and then had lyrics written by another person. The two were then superimposed on one another to form a coherent song. The union of the two is therefore artificial in a way that cannot be explained but only felt on an artistic level. Most folk songs, such as those of Woody Guthrie, were also composed this way, with new words put to older pre-existing folk melodies. This method of songwriting held back the art form, and the transformation to one individual songwriter composing both the music and the lyrics at the same time, both informing one another in a paradoxical chicken or the egg scenario, would coincide with the explosion of popular music that defined the 50s, which in turn would create the art form the Beatles would adopt. We will call this type of songwriting true songwriting, and those who do it true songwriters. The first true songwriters to emerge within modern music were the Delta blues musicians of the Deep South, musicians such as Charlie Patton and Robert Johnson. True songwriters had existed prior in history, such as the European troubadours, but the combination of technological development and the unique circumstances of the American South created an opportunity for it to emerge as the premier form of art. Although called Delta blues musicians, these artists were in themselves already a merger of two musical traditions, that being Western folk music and West African descended blues, and their songs were often not wholly blues or wholly folk. Out of this musical development emerged rock and roll, a lyrical yet exceedingly Dionysian form of music, which in its very name invokes carnal energy and motion, referring to both the intoxicated rocking of a Dionysian audience and the act of sex. From this movement, the artists who directly inspired the Beatles to become true songwriters themselves were created, the likes of Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. This movement was immensely popular, but was still an overly Dionysian form of art, which prevented it from reaching truly mass appeal. Its lyrics were carnal, chant-like, and intoxicating. This authentic musical innovation naturally overtook the previous position of Tin Pan Alley as the dominant form of popular music, which was too sheepish to present itself as purely Dionysian and too inherently Dionysian as a musical art to be truly Apollonian, which had since the time of Socrates been the much preferred form of art in the Western world. This is why when you think of European and Western history, you think of paintings and sculptures. Music has always served an important but immensely lesser role in Western life. But now that paradigm has been literally flipped on its head, with music being the preferred art of the Westerner, and visual art and sculptures the unimportant afterthought, with the 50s and 60s being pivot points of this phenomena. Immediately after, we get brutalist architecture and the modern school of visual art like Picasso and Pollock. These are desperate attempts to emulate the Dionysian in an art form which is fundamentally not Dionysian, just as classical music tried to emulate the Apollonian in an art form that is fundamentally not Apollonian. With the new art form of rock and roll already birthed, the Beatles were destined to bring it to its truly superior form by integrating the Apollonian in a way that Tin Pan Alley music had failed to, a development that was inevitable as the art form washed upon the shores of the capital of Apollonian art at the time, the British Isles, with its deep literary tradition. The inevitability of this movement is displayed by the movement of the British invasion as a whole, but the Beatles were still singularly destined to be at its peak due to the inherent Apollonian and Dionysian dynamic of its two main songwriters, John and Paul. Paul's association with the Apollonian is so blatantly obvious that one might have thought that he has portrayed himself in that way to explicitly reference Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. Paul's strength is his melodies. I've heard it said before that Paul's melodies sound almost like they've always existed, as if they are perfect in a way that seems obvious. But obvious in this case does not mean cliché. Like the interval of a perfect fifth in itself, its familiarity does not detract from its beauty. On top of this, Paul has famously stated that many of his melodies literally come from dreams. The most famous example being Yesterday, the most covered song in history. The melody he heard in his dream seemed already so familiar to him that he himself thought that he had heard it before, and that it wasn't his own. After playing it for others, he discovered that it was actually his own. The dreamlike quality of Paul McCartney's music is so extreme that he himself at times didn't believe that they were his own creations. Taken from a literal dream, Paul's most known work is more like a glimpse of a perfect form from Plato's heaven than a creation of man. John foiled Paul's Apollonian qualities so perfectly that I have at times suspected that the true genius of the Beatles was Paul, the whole time writing all of their music and using the partnership as a compelling story. Stories like the dispute over the authorship of In My Life have for a moment made me suspect this, but their individual solo careers reveal that this couldn't be the case. And that's what it's like to experience the true balance between Apollonian and Dionysian. The result is unworldly. Lennon is the more lyrical of the two, but his music has a quality that is unmistakably more Dionysian. While Yesterday feels like an eternal form that is only accessible through Apollo's dream world, Lennon's Strawberry Fields Forever feels like something that lies altogether outside the possibility of human experience. His lyrics are self-proclaimed nonsense, but yet somehow capture perfectly the Dionysian rapture that is contained in the music itself. The structure of his songs themselves also seem to dissolve border and form into pure chaos and energy. This dynamic was recognized by Lennon himself, who always thought of himself as the rocker of the two, and Paul as the ballad guy, given his Tin Pan Alley background he received from his father. John's music was always about evoking transcending feeling, as opposed to Paul's transcending form. These dynamics were not just relegated to the realm of music, but were also embedded in their personalities, with John from the start being the rebellious rocker and Paul the bright schoolboy. Where Paul had real undeniable talent, John was a crazy son of a bitch, as Paul said. The true phenomenon of the Beatles was the friendship and association between the two. Even when they weren't literally writing with one another, just the idea of having to meet the other person's artistic taste brought each of their compositions to new heights. And when they did truly collaborate, they created timeless classics, such as A Day in the Life, arguably their most beloved track. We know that their relationship and dynamic is what made the Beatles special, because we know what their music sounds like in isolation from one another. Lennon's solo music had artistic vision and feel, but became too chaotic and abstract at times. He needed Paul to give him form. And on the other hand, Paul was too polished, no longer venturing into the unknown formless world that John had pulled him into. Like the Apollonian and the Dionysian, Paul and John, when together and in balance, were far greater than they could ever be on their own. I don't know if I fully believe in this Dionysian and Apollonian thing that Nietzsche talks about in his first work, but I've been revisiting The Birth of Tragedy, and it seems like a better explanation for the development in Western art in recent history than anything else I've heard. So anyway, thanks for watching, hit that like button and subscribe.